Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a little bit afraid to tell you this because I'm not a blogger anymore. I used to be a blogger. It makes me very sad to say that my blog, The Poor, which I began in early 2006, died in an untimely death about a year ago. The life of the poor speaks to the conditions that I blogged under. People called me a blogger, but I never really felt like one. Obviously, I was working, and I still am working for a big company, and I guess I would be what's called a corporate blogger. And people used to interview me about blogging and ask me questions about all of the mundane tasks that bloggers have to go through, maintaining the blog format, dealing with software, counting the audience. I never had to do anything like that. I had people who did all that for me. And so there were great advantages to my corporate world, but there were also disadvantages. I was very, very proud of The Poor, and I loved writing it. And the editors at the Times felt that if they took my thriving community and combined it with the blog that the restaurant critic was writing, they would have an even more populous community, and it would be better for everybody. And so they combined all these blogs into one sort of mega blog called Diner's Journal. And as far as I was concerned, this was done over my objections, and I realized since this is being recorded for posterity, I must say that my editors are brilliant people who are barely wrong. But in this case, I disagreed with them, and I think I was right, because I don't really see much of a community there anymore, and I feel kind of sad about that, although I do contribute to Diner's Journal occasionally. So I wondered when I was invited to speak here whether this disqualified me from talking to a group of bloggers. And I wondered, what really is a blogger anyway? I went back through the archives of the Times to see when we first used the word, and it was in late 2000. So it's been around longer than I had imagined, and in typical Times fashion, it took us maybe 3 years to stop offering the little explanation that blogger is short for a writer of a web blog. Finally, we did drop that. We use the term blogger all the time, but I really wonder whether the term blogger is really meaningful to anybody anymore. It seems to me that nowadays, as Jansen pointed out, a blogger is really a writer on the internet. You've got a specific personalized format for a blog, and in fact, while you can call a blogger a writer, you can also call a blogger an editor and a publisher. And even though I used to be a blogger, I don't really feel qualified to talk about the platform, the technical issues, the marketing opportunities that you look for. But I do feel qualified to talk about what brings us all together now, and I think that's writing. And just as a side note, Jansen had suggested yesterday that bloggers really ought to respect the traditional media a little bit more, not look down on mainstream print. And I have to say that I never really felt that bloggers ever did look down on mainstream print. I felt that there was a defensiveness because mainstream media looked down on bloggers. And I think that it's quite clear with all of you sitting here that that issue has been well resolved blogging is clearly established, voices are being heard, and it's time to think of ourselves all simply as writers. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my life as a writer, and I thought that even though I got into writing for newspapers in the 1980s, which is a universe ago and really has very little use as a template for anybody today, it would still be useful because my experiences have certainly shaped my attitudes towards wine and towards writing about wine. And I think that might be useful for all of you. I was hired, I started out as a journalist. I was not in the wine field or the food field, but I was a very passionate lover of restaurants, food, of cooking, of wine, beer, drinking. And this is something that has kind of driven me. I actually got started in national news. One of my first jobs at the New York Times, where I was hired when I was very young, was to be the late night editor of national news. And this basically meant that after everybody else went home, I would sit there till 3 in the morning, just in case something happened. I would get it into the newspaper. If there was a train accident, or somebody died, Doc Gooden got busted for drugs, that sort of thing. Most practically speaking, though, it meant I had nothing to do for the hours between 1 and 3 in the morning. And I thought, well, why don't I use this time to do some writing? That's what I really wanted to do. I had no interest in being an editor. And I was really interested in food. And at this time, back in the early 80s, particularly at a place like the New York Times, even though we had a restaurant critic and we had Frank Pyle, who was the first regular wine columnist for a daily newspaper in this country, it really wasn't taken that seriously. And most of my colleagues my age wanted to be, they wanted to cover politics, presidential races, go off and follow wars, and be foreign correspondents, and that would be, I had nothing against that. I would have been thrilled to do something like that as well, but I was really passionate about food and wine, and I started using this time to write. And because I had very little competition for getting stories into the food and wine section, I was able to kind of walk right through a door and get my things published. So for me, I had an opportunity, and I had energy and desire and perseverance, and I was able to step into a role, essentially carve out a role for myself that probably that sort of opportunity doesn't exist, certainly at daily newspapers anymore, because these positions are now very much coveted. But over time, I eventually became an editor in food and wine. Then I started reviewing inexpensive restaurants almost 20 years ago, and eventually started writing about wine as well. And since 2004, I've been writing exclusively about wine. And during that time, there's been an amazing revolution in our American attitudes towards food, towards wine, and of the attitudes of journalists to these subjects. Because back in the 70s and 80s, wine and food was not considered a serious subject. Most newspapers would just hire somebody from the community to offer some recipes. Wine, there were very few wine writers at the time, and those that were there were often very much wrapped up in the wine business, in the wine industry. And while that was a kind of a traditional mode in Britain, it didn't work so well here, particularly as people began to take the subject more seriously. It became necessary to really carve out a strong journalistic role for covering wine and food. And since then, people have become very serious in the way they cover. They're no longer mixed up with the industry, certainly at the New York Times. And when I took the job of full-time wine writer in 2004, they gave me the title wine critic. And I know in blogs there's often a sort of a battle between the meaning between wine writer and wine critic, in which the writer is said to write profiles and cover the wine industry in a broad, more writerly way, and the critic is more nose in the glass, writing tasting notes and scores and not really getting out. And I don't really see that there has to be a firm divide. At the Times, the critic is a very specific sort of job title that up until then had been reserved for covering matters of culture. We had the film critic, the theater critic, the art critic, dance critic, restaurant critic, and it wasn't until 2004 that wine was considered a subject worthy of having somebody whose primary function was analysis, reflection, treating wine as a matter of culture. So I'm very proud of having that title, and I'm very thankful of the work that my predecessor, Frank Preil, did, who never had the title, but to make people realize at the New York Times that this was a subject very much worthy of serious coverage. I learned about wine in a very different way than I see many people learning these days. I never took a class in wine. This was something that I taught myself. Incidentally, one of the things that really bothers me is the term wine appreciation. You know, we're always thinking about teaching people to appreciate wine as if it's something genteel that a good bourgeois society should know something about. And it misses completely the emotional connection that I think people need to have wine to really get into it. So my wine studies were almost very organic. I grew up in the 70s, which is a little bit more permissive than today, and I used to write beer reviews for my high school newspaper. This was, back then the drinking age was 18, but of course, you know, I was still in high school and I hadn't quite made it there, but it was an era of experimentation, and this was something that just sort of came naturally to me, and it wasn't until many years later that I realized, you know, that very early on I had taken on a role that I was well suited for. But I really got into wine as a graduate student at the University of Texas in Austin, a lovely place back in the 80s, and I found, as fascinated as I was with eating, with cooking, wine was a natural and essential part of the assembling of a meal. And so my friends and I used to go shopping for food. We used to go shopping for wine, and most of the time they were the big 1.5 liters of Minervois. There was no thriving California wine industry at the time. And I had a lot of experience drinking cheap wine and looking for values in wine. And I find that these experiences, which grew into obsessions for me, were just kind of, were critical in how I developed a feeling of where wine belongs. Part of a meal on the table with family, with friends, part of an ensemble that doesn't venerate wine as something fetishistic or something that you have to chase after. It's just part of a meal, and that's a wonderful thing. Eventually, as I got more serious about wine, I did my own tastings. I did a lot of travel to vineyards and producers, and I was able to educate myself, and perhaps that sort of education is responsible for certain eccentricities that I might have in my attitudes towards wine. But I think it was very important to me because I learned to think about wine in terms of drinking it, not in terms of tasting it. And I think very often we confuse the two. Our wine education system in this country begins by teaching people how to taste wine, which is an exercise that can be very useful in some point of one's development as a wine lover, but I think misses the point in forming that emotional connection that people who really love wine have with wine. I had that attitude about wine, and I had an attitude as a consumer looking for values, and to that I had a kind of the attitude of a journalist. And the crucial thing about my training as a journalist was that I learned that my loyalty is to the reader, to the consumer, in this case to the newspaper, but never to the wine industry. So I have always thought about my writing as being in service of wine consumers, never to build a customer base, to get people interested in particular areas for wine. It's to serve their interests. And I still see, often in blogs, a confusion of interest. I realize that a lot of people here sitting in this room actually work for wineries or work as marketers, and I think that even you can distinguish between good marketing and bad marketing, as was done very aptly on the Millennial panel yesterday. When you make people feel, when you make readers feel that you have their interests in mind, it's a tremendous obstacle that you've overcome. So it's very important as writers to decide what your priorities are. Now, once you've started on the path of writing about wine, you have to figure out what you're going to do. You have to, number one, accumulate experience. And in this case, I think it's critical to drink a lot of wine. That may sound like a truism, but I think there's a tremendous difference between drinking wine and simply going to tastings. For example, we had the wonderful tasting at Monticello last night, where I get to taste a lot of interesting wines. But to think that gave me a deep insight into the state of the Virginia wine industry, or the variety available, the problems the industry confronts, or the quality of the wines, I would be fooling myself. It's a very, very much a beginning. And to really understand a wine, you have to actually acquire bottles. And rather than sip and spit, you have to drink them. And you actually have to drink them with food, with people, however you choose to do it, but you have to drink them. And I know that sounds like a completely obvious, and yet at the same time, I see so many people who feel that tasting gives great insight into wine, that I think it has to be said. I have two sons, and when they were much younger, they used to want to keep track of every state that they had been to. And they would keep a list and figure out which states they wanted to go to. And they would have great debates over whether, if you changed planes at an airport, that counted as setting foot in the state, and you could put it on the list. And I see wine the same way. A lot of people like to keep lists of the wines that they've had, as if there's some sort of master checkoff thing. And no, it's really an accumulation of bottles of experience in the service of developing context of many different wines that you've had in many different conditions. And that helps to develop a point of view. Developing a point of view as a writer, I think that everybody here would be served by thinking about what it means to write as a journalist. And I think this is worth thinking about, whether you are writing poetically or novelistically or as a marketer. Still, the principles of journalism should very much guide you in what you're doing. Number one, curiosity. Again, it sounds like a truism. We're all here because we're curious about wine, but being curious really requires, as Jancis pointed out yesterday, a feeling of humility and a realization that we as wine writers don't need to be know-it-alls. In fact, it's much more important, thinking as a reporter, to ask questions rather than to tell what you know. And parenthetically, Jancis mentioned Edmund Penning Rosell, who was one of her predecessors at the Financial Times, but according to Wikipedia, was also the wine writer for Marxism Today. And I just think that any man who can straddle that divide is just incredibly versatile, and I admire that. Who says communists don't have a good time? Aside from curiosity, just as important is having a healthy sense of skepticism. How does that apply to writing about wine? Well, I think within all of us, there's at some level a deep sort of insecurity about wine. There's so much to know, and we come at it from a beginning, a point of not knowing very much. And many of us start writing about wine when we still don't know very much. And that makes us both very eager to demonstrate what we do know, and maybe not quite adept at doubting what we're told. And many years ago, I read a novel called The Cane Mutiny. And this is a book that's set in the Pacific during World War II about a destroyer minesweeper. And there's a recurring line in this book that has resonated with me over the years. Where one character says, "You can't assume a goddamn thing in the Navy." And I thought about that all the time, because we make so many assumptions about wine, maybe things that we've read here or we've read there. If you're my age and grew up in America and got into wine, you probably read a lot of Robert Parker in the 80s. I know I did. And you developed there's a set of assumptions. For example, low yields are always better in a vineyard, right? I mean, we know that because it's been said often enough. And perhaps Parker was writing at a time when overcropping was a serious issue around the wine-producing world, and it was something that needed to be emphasized. But I would urge everybody, if you ever visit a vineyard, particularly in the Old World, to have a discussion about yields. And you find that many people, particularly producers who were never quoted, farmers who were never quoted in the newspaper, who never would be shocked to ever see their name mentioned in print, have deep thoughts about yields. And yes, high yields are not good, but maybe low yields are not so good either. Maybe there's a special point for every vine that is a perfect point, and this would raise questions about repeating things like that. Oak barrels, are they friends or foes? Well, for a time, 100% new oak was a great thing. Then oak became the enemy, and we had no oak Chardonnay, and Enox, and steel tank Chardonnay, and each point becomes a marketing point, and writers are often caught somewhere in between, not questioning whether oak is a friend or oak is foe. And you have to really dive deep and decide what the role of an oak barrel is. And personally speaking, oak is bad, but oak is good. And you find your own way. Alcohol. The alcohol level is not important. Balance is what's important. Well, this is an argument that we're fighting right now in this country, and it gets discussed ad nauseum. And I don't know how many people have really kind of pursued this question before they've written this. I know there are many things that I've written that, looking back over the years, I wonder, wow, I wish I hadn't said that. I wish I had done a little bit more investigating. I wish I had been a little bit more skeptical. Red wine with meat, white wine with fish. Well, we've all tossed that old law out, but is it really worth tossing it out? Maybe it's a good guideline, even though there are many exceptions for it. Wine was made in the vineyard. We all like to be good Burgundians and think that, but I mean, how true is that? How many times are we going to let a wine producer get away with telling us that? And how many times are we going to repeat that in a column because it's something that we have heard so many times? Wine demystification. We all want to demystify wine, right? Listening to some of the panels yesterday, that seemed to be an important thing. But why? Why do we want to demystify wine? What's the purpose of demystifying it? Should it be demystified? Maybe, as Terry Thies, the importer, says, we should remystify wine. That, in fact, is something that I kind of believe. So the message here is to question everything that you're told. Look things up in books like the Oxford Companion, but just because you read something in a newspaper or in a book doesn't automatically mean it's true. You have to be skeptical. And there's a corollary to you can't assume a goddamn thing in the Navy. This goes back to when I was I had the first job I ever had in newspapers. I worked as a part-time at the Hartford Courant. I answered a classified ad. They needed a copy editor, and I needed a job. And I thought I could do this because my father was a newspaper man, and I never took a journalism class, but they hired me. And so there I was, 22 years old, my long hair and beard, going into this newsroom and trying to act like I knew what I was doing. And I remember I was editing a story, some city story about Hartford, and they mentioned some councilman. And I asked the old grizzled guy sitting next to me if the councilman was a Democrat. And he looked at me like he couldn't decide whether my question was worth answering. He took his pipe out of his mouth. People used to smoke in newsrooms. Yes, Virginia, there used to be a tobacco industry. And he said, "Kid, never listen to the fucking idiot sitting next to you." And I took that to heart, and I repeat that to myself every single day. And you know, the basic message is you got to look everything up yourself. You have to get the answer yourself. You can't take the easy way out there. There's a major difference between evidence and what somebody told you, and we're all responsible for what we write. You can't print what you hear, but what you don't know. So all these things are important. You have to apply your experience and your principles to your writing, and you have to ask yourself, what is it that you really want to accomplish? And if you look around the blogging world, and you look to see who really sticks out, I'm thinking of a few people who aren't in this room, so I'll name names. Gary Vaynerchuk, if you can call him a blogger, and I do, he went where nobody went before, and he did it successfully. He carved out a pure and clear identity for himself. He used new language, he created a new persona, and he was very appealing to a younger age group. Is he demystifying wine? No, he did the same that many other people did, although he talked about wine in terms of taste and aroma, although his vocabulary was completely ridiculous as far as I might be concerned, and arcane. But he did something more important than that. By appearing on video, tasting and spitting into a football helmet. I mean, whoever thought that you could watch this visually? I remember Jancis and Frank Pryl had a TV show once and where they drank and spat, and I thought, this doesn't work on television. But Gary created something, and what he did was cut out the hilltop, cut out the omniscience. No longer did you have a wine authority sitting somewhere way up high and handing down judgments and scores and being perfect and being omniscient and never making a mistake. No, he's sitting there, he's mispronouncing words, he's making mistakes, he's getting the bottle wrong, but he's loving wine, and even if he's issuing scores and speaking about wine in this very crazy kind of way, he's making people feel more comfortable about it. And in fact, he's very humble in his own way. And he asks the question of whether a wine writer really has to be an arbiter of the good life, the way we have perceived the wine writer for so many years. I don't know if anybody here has ever read Brooklyn Guy. Brooklyn Guy Loves Wine. One of my favorite blogs. He was a guy in New York City, and he just decided he would start writing about wine because he loved cooking. He didn't know a whole lot. And he has written an entire blog without ever once talking down to anybody or trying to overtly teach or be pedantic. He's incredibly unassuming. He's written a blog about discovery and learning, and it's the sweetest, most entrancing blog because he's never tried to be anything that he wasn't. And this is very, very different. He's just, again, extremely humble about his attitude towards wine. Alice Firing, who I know you're all familiar with, whatever you may feel about her message, her voice, her point of view, it's unmistakable and it's distinctive. You might not agree with her, but you know where she's coming from, for sure. So this is a crucial point. As you are making decisions about what your voice is going to be, what your point of view is going to be, how you're going to connect with the audience, it's important to realize that all of you have the power to shape the future of American wine culture. We all sense that Americans are not comfortable with wine. Many of the people I heard speak yesterday talked about how they wanted to get past that, how they wanted to help younger people feel more comfortable with wine. And it's important to ask ourselves why the anxiety, the doubt, why do people feel inadequate when confronted with what is basically such a pleasurable thing. And I think it's important to understand that how we think and talk and write about wine really does shape how consumers feel about wine. So it's important to ask yourself how you write about wine. Do you write about wine in tasting notes, in that sort of vocabulary of the litany of aromas and flavors that so many of us find so maddening, but also find inescapable? Why do we write like that? Is this something that we're just assuming is the way wine is discussed? Maybe this is something that we really need to apply skepticism to. Why do we write about wine like that? Is it because in America we've read Parker, we've read The Spectator, we've read the Wine Enthusiast, Wine and Spirits, and that's how they all talk about wine? Does that mean we have to talk about wine that way also? I don't think so. For the record, I think if you go to Jancis's website, you'll see a whole variety of writing. Some of her colleagues do write about wine in what I think of as the Pain school, listing all sorts of esoteric aromas and flavors. I don't believe that Jancis writes that way. I think you have to ask yourself, does it really matter whether a wine is redolent of boysenberries or raspberries? I mean, is it going to change your opinion of it? Are you going to buy that wine because it does have boysenberries or because it has raspberries? I don't think it matters. I think you would agree. Petrol. How many of you have ever used the term petrol in writing about wine? I see that a lot. What does that mean for Americans? We don't even use that word, petrol. We don't know what it means. I mean, maybe it's a wine that smells like kerosene or gasoline or some petroleum product. Maybe it indicates that a Riesling is gone on the arc of aging. But there are ways that we can say that directly without using words like petrol, which are meaningless to an American audience, more or less, and quite often meaningless to the writers who use them. Okay, I'm going to have to speed it up here. In the place of these sort of specifics, though, I urge people to write, to use generalities when talking about wine. It's not an ego thing. It's not a measure of how acute your senses are if you can list all sorts of aromas and flavors. And it's much more helpful to talk about characteristics of a wine. Is it fruity, lean, savory, flabby, zesty, mineral? Talk about the weight, the texture, and the broad nature of the aromas and flavors. Scores, of course, we all have to make individual decisions about scores. I personally am sympathetic to consumers' desire to see scores. It cuts through all that verbiage and it makes buying decisions much easier. But as a writer myself, I abhor them. I think they're detrimental to understanding wine. Using one objective scale for wine puts all wines on that objective scale. So we know that a 90-point wine is better than an 88-point wine, but maybe that 88-point wine is better for an oyster dinner or better for spaghetti and meatballs. You can't apply the score system to wines when you need to know a context for making decisions. You need to know food, mood, and context matters more than scores. Scores put spotlight only on the best, and so certain categories of wine never really achieve high scores. Beaujolais never scores high, and yet these can be some of the best wines. There can be certain situations where a Beaujolais is better than a Grand Cru Burgundy. And of course, we would never turn down a Grand Cru Burgundy given the opportunities, which are so scarce. But all things being equal, we might want that Moulin Avant instead of La Tâche. So everyday wines are diminished by scoring, and you can see it. You can see the effect in our own culture. If you look at California wines, you see all the wonderful scores that are given to Napa Valley wines. And what happens? These wines become very expensive. What are we to drink when we're not drinking big fancy Napa Valley cabs or the equivalent of Grand Cru Burgundies? We're left with daily wines from California that are imitation 90-point wines. Instead of making wines to be consumed every day, they use various manipulations, whether oak chips or whatever, to create facsimiles of the wines that get 90 points. And for as far as I'm concerned, those wines are useless. Since we first used the term blog in the New York Times, there have been incredible changes in the wine writing world. Instead of the two dominant voices that we used to have, we've got a wonderful profusion of voices. There's been a great decentralization of power. In fact, we have voices not just from all corners of this country, but from all over the world. And even in the Wine Advocate, the great stereotype of the centralized power in wine, now you have multiple voices there as well. So we have a wonderful opportunity now for more voices to be heard. And like good wines, which need to be distinctive, we have to be distinctive in our points of view. We have to have credibility, but we also have to understand where the world is heading as far as wine goes. The old notion of the wine connoisseur is dead. We have to just understand that. The audience is no longer rich white people, rich white men. It's all kinds of people, all kinds of ethnicities, men, women, all over. The benchmark wines of old that are still, we still think of today as benchmarks, Bordeaux, Grand Cru Burgundy, these are in some senses becoming irrelevant, sadly so, because they're priced out of most people's lives, and we can't taste them and use them as yardsticks in the way that we used to. But we have to understand that today there's a 21st century connoisseur that is alive and thriving. And the 21st century connoisseur understands that there is a wonderful wealth of great wines available to us. There's more diversity available to us than ever before. Different regions of France, for example, Beaujolais, the Loire, Jura, Rouligy, little-known areas of Spain, Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe. Wines that were for centuries consumed locally are now available all over the world and making this kind of an awkward transition as they become globally prized. Small areas that nobody ever heard of 20 years ago, Ribera Sacra, Bierzo, wines from the Basque Country, Sicily, Lambruscos, Basilicata, Santorini, maybe even Virginia. There are so many wonderful wines available now. And I think that people who are really connoisseurs today understand this diversity and prize it. And you know, I just read somebody who was assailing wine writers for ignoring the great mass of wines that real people drink. And this wine writer used the example of Barefoot, which is the biggest selling brand now in the United States. And he scoured publications like mine and could find no mention of it and said, well, you know, look at this huge disconnect between writers and their audience. And I really thought that was absurd. You have to understand the difference between real wines that are expressions of culture and of interest, and commodity wines. And it's a little bit like writing about food. The great majority of people eat if they eat out at all, they eat in franchise restaurants, fast food restaurants, restaurants that, as a restaurant critic, doesn't spend much time with because they're of little interest. Restaurant critics write about this very small segment of restaurants, appealing to a very narrow majority. But this is where, if you care about food, where the excitement and interest and creativity is. And the same is true in wine. It's very important not to confuse something that might have some mass appeal. I mean, really the bottom line between writing about barefoot and writing about, I don't know, Gallo, Hardy, Burgundy, or whatever, who cares? But there are great wines, so many great wines of interest that are worth writing about, regardless of the numbers. And there is a huge audience fascinated with these wines. So the bottom line is that the opportunity to be heard is out there. It's a strange thing to say to bloggers, given the stereotypes of bloggers sitting in the cellar writing in pajamas in your mother's house. But the time really has come as writers for all of you, for all of us, to stress professionalism, whether it's skepticism, developing point of view, questioning, even if writing, blogging is a labor of love. Professionalism is the key to credibility, and that, combined with having a voice, is the key to being heard. Thank you very much. I hope I've got a few minutes for some questions. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Don't all jump up at once, yeah.
With all of us in the room together now, if you could give us a group assignment that all the bloggers could do together that would contribute to the wine world, what would it be? No pressure.
Nothing like putting me on the spot. You know what? I would say go for the next year without ever once writing a tasting note. Write only about the wines that you've actually consumed, and write about wine in a way that has nothing to do with simply describing the characteristics of that wine. I think that here are the blogs that I have no interest in. I just went to the big Zinfandel tasting, and my notes on the 60 wines I tasted will be, I'll put them up tomorrow. Forget it. Who cares? But if you can write and tell me what it is you love about Zinfandel, where it fits into your life, where it fits into your dinners, if you can inspire me to want to go out and drink that Zinfandel, I will be much, much happier. So yeah, that's what I would say. No tasting notes. Yes?
You mentioned Terry Peace's book a few minutes ago.
Yes.
I bought that book. It's a very inspiring book. And there was one passage in it that it's really haunted me for about a year now. It says that if you really want to develop your voice and your palate, spend 3 months or 6 months and drink nothing but one type of red, one type of white. And that's how you really learn to hone your palate. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, either as developing your palate or developing your blogger voice.
Does everybody hear that question? He's talking about Terry Thies's book, Reading Between the Vines, which is kind of a facile pun, but the book is much deeper than the title would have you believe. And in the book, Terry suggests that if you really want to develop your palate, spend 3 months or 6 months drinking nothing but one specific sort of wine so that you really, really get to know it. And I would say, well, yeah, that's a good thing to do, but highly impractical for most of us. And you know, there's the old Isaiah Berlin formulation of the hedgehog and the fox, the person who goes deeply into one thing and the person who spreads widely and pursues many things. And I think you can learn about wine both ways without going to such extremes. Absolutely immerse yourself in a wine as long as you are benefiting from that and loving it, and don't, you know, give yourself an assignment and force yourself to do something to the point of disagreeability. You know, just absolutely pursue things, but don't hem yourself in. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, that's a good way. Yeah, plunge deeply. Yes, Remy.
Just you talked about the notes and the numbers, and we've talked about that before, and I think we're on the same side generally. But when you do the panels, I think it might be a nuance to put there, because when you do the tasting panels at the New York Times, and any, I think, kind of collective tasting to produce a certain sorting out requires some kind of classification. Could you perhaps elaborate on that?
Well, Remy has caught me in one of the basic contradictions in my life. You know, I'm basically against doing big clinical tastings as a way to really get to know wine. But at the same time, it's often a practical necessity if you're trying to write for a consumer and give some choices for them to pursue. So in my wine panel, where we drink a lot of wine, where we taste a lot of wines and spit a lot of wines, I write somewhat cryptic notes, which I hope don't get too deep into the horrible esoteric language that I have been criticizing, and we don't really give scores, but we assign a star value to the wines, and I would defend that because those are not sort of indelibly imprinted on people's minds. You know, we don't really distinguish so much between a 3 and a 2.5 star wine when it comes to going out and buying something. Recently, I had written a column suggesting that we use only 2 words in describing a wine: sweet and savory. And I ended up getting in a lot of trouble for that, because maybe sweet is not the best word it's a little too confusing when talking about wines that are basically dry but fruity or fruit-oriented, as opposed to wines that have different more mineral characteristics. But to answer your question, it's something I struggle with all the time, and even though I'm being maybe overly prescriptive in my recommendations, I do recognize that it's something we all have to struggle with. One more question. Anybody? Yes?
Not so much of a question. I wanted to see if you could give us a sample high school